During the Cold War, Americans were told a comforting story. They were told that if the unthinkable ever happened, if nuclear war broke out, there was a plan to protect the government, a plan to protect the country, a plan to protect them. Posters were printed, films were shown in schools, civil defense drills were rehearsed. Children learned to duck and cover, families were told to build shelters, and everyone was encouraged to believe that survival was possible. But behind closed doors, the real plans looked very different. What most Americans never knew was that, while the public was being reassured, the U.S. government was quietly preparing for a future where millions would die, cities would vanish in minutes, and the country would be forced to continue without them. These were not contingency plans designed to save the population. They were continuity plans designed to save power. Deep beneath mountains, hidden inside remote bunkers, buried under ordinary-looking buildings, the United States built an invisible second country, one that would only activate after nuclear war, a country with its own leaders, its own laws, its own chain of command. And in that future, most citizens were never meant to be part of it. For decades, these plans were among the most classified secrets in American history. Even many members of Congress didn't know the full scope of what had been built, or who had been chosen to survive. There were lists, there were rehearsals, there were secret flights in the dead of night, and there was one terrifying assumption behind all of it, that nuclear war was not only possible, but manageable. The government called it continuity of government, but in practice it meant deciding in advance who mattered after the end of the world. If Washington was destroyed, a small group of officials would disappear into the earth. If communication collapsed, emergency broadcasters would speak from hidden studios. If society fell apart, the Constitution itself could be quietly suspended, and the public would likely never know it happened. Some of these plans were activated, not during war, but during moments of fear. Others were rehearsed so often that entire underground cities were kept on permanent standby. Even today, parts of these systems are still active, still funded, still staffed, still waiting. This is not a story about conspiracy theories. This is a story about documents, declassified files, and facilities you were never supposed to see. It's the story of how America prepared to survive the Cold War, by planning a future where most of its people wouldn't. And once you understand how these emergency plans really worked, you'll never look at national security the same way again. In the years immediately after World War II, Americans believed they had survived the worst war in human history. Cities were intact. Factories were running. Families were rebuilding their lives. There was relief, but not peace, because something entirely new had entered the world. In August of 1945, the atomic bomb had ended the war in Japan, and in doing so, it introduced a reality no government had ever faced before. A single weapon could now erase an entire city in minutes. At first, the United States believed it held a permanent advantage. It had the bomb. No one else did. But that confidence didn't last long. In 1949, the Soviet Union successfully tested its own atomic weapon. For the first time in history, America had a rival capable of destroying it. Not slowly, not through invasion, but instantly. That moment quietly changed everything. From that point forward, the central question inside the U.S. government was no longer if another war would happen. It was what would remain afterward. Military planners began running simulations. What would happen if New York was hit? What if Washington disappeared in a flash? What if communication between cities collapsed? The answers were grim. Most scenarios ended the same way. Millions dead, infrastructure destroyed, government leadership decapitated within minutes. And that led to a disturbing realization. The greatest vulnerability wasn't the military. It was governance itself. If the president, Congress, and military command were wiped out in the opening moments of a nuclear strike, the country would effectively cease to function, even if millions were still alive. So the problem became clear. How do you keep a country running after the end of the world? In the early 1950s, the solution began to take shape. Quietly, methodically, and almost entirely out of public view, the government began developing what it called emergency relocation plans. At first, they sounded simple. If Washington was threatened, key officials would be moved to safer locations. If communication lines were cut, backups would be activated. If leadership was lost, successors would step in. But as the plans evolved, they grew darker and far more permanent. Officials realized evacuation wouldn't be possible after an attack. Everything would have to happen before. That meant pre-selecting locations, pre-selecting personnel, pre-selecting who would be saved. Across the country, engineers and planners began searching for places that could survive a nuclear blast. Mountains, remote valleys, rural areas far from major cities. What they built were not simple shelters. They were underground command centers, designed to operate for weeks or months in total isolation. Inside these facilities, there would be living quarters, power generation, water purification, communication systems, and fully functional offices, enough to run a nation in exile. At the same time, the government faced another uncomfortable truth. There was no way to protect everyone. Civil defense films told families to build backyard shelters. School drills taught children to hide under desks. But internally, planners knew these measures offered little real protection against nuclear weapons. The public drills served another purpose. They maintained order. They prevented panic. And they preserved the belief that survival was a shared effort, when in reality, survival was already being decided behind closed doors. By the mid-1950s, the United States had quietly accepted something unprecedented: that in the event of nuclear war, the country would be divided into two groups, those who would likely perish, and those who would inherit what remained. This was not discussed openly, it wasn't debated on the evening news, and it certainly wasn't put to a vote. It was treated as a technical necessity, a matter of national security. And from that mindset emerged a system that would operate in secrecy for decades, one that blurred the line between democracy and emergency rule. A system that assumed the Constitution itself might not survive intact. By the end of the 1950s, these plans were no longer theoretical. They were being rehearsed, regularly, silently, and with the expectation that one day they would be used. In the next part, we'll see how these emergency plans evolved into a parallel government, complete with secret bunkers, hidden chains of command, and rehearsals that mimicked the end of the United States as the public knew it. By the late 1950s, America's emergency plans had moved beyond theory. They were no longer just documents in filing cabinets or simulations on military tables. They were becoming physical. Concrete was poured. Steel doors were installed. Entire facilities were carved into rock. Across the United States, a hidden network was taking shape, quietly, deliberately, and almost entirely outside public awareness. Officially, these sites didn't exist. They were described as storage depots, communication centers, or ordinary government buildings. Some were disguised as resorts. Others were placed beneath nondescript structures that attracted no attention at all. But beneath the surface, they shared a single purpose: to ensure that a functioning government would survive, even if the nation above it was destroyed. This was the beginning of what insiders would later call a shadow government, not in the sense of a conspiracy, but in the sense of redundancy, a backup America. The concept was simple in theory. If a nuclear attack wiped out Washington, a pre-selected group of officials would be relocated to hardened facilities. From there, they would assume control, issue orders, and maintain continuity until the crisis passed. But in practice, the system required answers to questions few democracies ever face. Who gets selected? Who decides? And what powers would they hold? To solve this, planners created detailed succession lists, not just for the president, but for every major department. If the Secretary of Defense was killed, who took over? If Congress was gone, who had legislative authority? If courts were destroyed, who interpreted the law? The answers were written quietly into emergency directives. In many cases, they granted extraordinary powers to unelected officials, on the assumption that elections would be impossible in the aftermath of nuclear war. This wasn't viewed as a power grab. It was framed as survival. Inside these bunkers, the Constitution would still exist, but in a suspended state. Certain rights could be delayed, certain procedures bypassed, certain decisions centralized. All of it justified by a single phrase: temporary emergency authority. But as the Cold War intensified, that temporary state began to look less temporary. The Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 pushed the system to the brink. For 13 days, the world stood on the edge of nuclear war. And during that time, parts of the continuity system were quietly activated. Government officials were placed on alert, transportation plans were reviewed, secure communication channels were tested. Some officials later admitted they had prepared to leave their families behind, without being able to explain why. The public saw speeches and televised addresses. Behind the scenes, the machinery of a buried government was warming up. After the crisis passed, the system didn't disappear, it expanded. More bunkers were built. Existing ones were upgraded. New layers of secrecy were added. By the late 1960s, the continuity apparatus had become a permanent feature of national security planning. Entire agencies were quietly assigned roles in post-attack governance. Emergency broadcasting systems were established, capable of transmitting messages, even if most of the country's infrastructure was destroyed. Alternate command centers were stocked with food, fuel, and supplies for weeks or months of isolation. And perhaps most importantly, drills were institutionalized. These weren't public drills like duck and cover exercises. They were internal rehearsals, conducted under code names, often without full explanation to participants. Officials would be told to report to specific locations at specific times. Flights would be scheduled under false pretenses. Convoys would move at night. Communication blackouts would be simulated, all to practice the same scenario. The United States has been attacked. Washington is gone. You are now the government. For many involved, the experience was unsettling. Some later described it as stepping into an alternate reality, one where familiar institutions were stripped down to their most basic functions. No press, no public debate, no visible accountability. Only command, control, and survival. What made this system especially unusual was how little oversight it had. Because of its classified nature, even many elected officials had limited visibility into how it worked, or how powerful it had become. In effect, a parallel structure existed alongside the visible government. It was dormant, but ready. Invisible, but funded, and increasingly autonomous. As the years passed, the Cold War normalized this state of preparedness. Nuclear war became something people lived with, not something they expected tomorrow, but not something they dismissed either. And so the underground government remained in place, waiting. In the next part, we'll examine the people chosen to inhabit this hidden world, how they were selected, what they were told, and what it meant to be designated as someone expected to survive the end of the United States as the public knew it. As the Cold War progressed, one question lingered beneath every emergency plan, not spoken publicly, not written into civil defense pamphlets, but quietly embedded into every decision. Who would remain when everything else was gone? The answer was never simple. Survival in these plans was not about morality or fairness. It was about function. The government didn't ask who deserved to survive. It asked who would be necessary. The selection process unfolded gradually, over years. At first it focused on obvious figures, the president, senior military leaders, key cabinet members. But as planners thought further ahead, they realized leadership alone was not enough. A country couldn't operate without engineers, communications specialists, medical personnel, intelligence analysts, logistics experts. So the lists expanded. Each department quietly identified individuals considered essential, not famous names, not public figures. Mostly mid-level officials, people with technical knowledge, institutional memory, and the ability to function under extreme pressure. Many never knew they were on the list. Others were told, but only partially. They were informed that, in the event of a national emergency, They might be asked to report to a secure location. No further explanation, no guarantees, and no mention of how long they might be gone. Families were rarely included. This was one of the most painful realities of the system. Bunkers had limited capacity. Every additional person meant fewer resources. In many cases, spouses and children were not cleared. The assumption was unspoken but clear. Those chosen might survive. Their families might not. Some officials later described living with that knowledge for years, going to work, attending family dinners, knowing that if the alert ever came, they would have minutes to decide whether to obey orders or stay behind. There were no official guidelines for that choice, only silence. By the 1970s, the process had become more refined and more unsettling. Psychological evaluations were quietly incorporated. Planners wanted people who could function without sunlight, without fresh air, without normal social structures. People who would follow orders, people who would not panic, people who would accept isolation as duty. Those who showed signs of emotional instability, strong ideological resistance, or reluctance to accept emergency authority were often excluded, without being told why. This wasn't personal, it was operational. Inside the bunkers, hierarchy mattered. Command structures were rigid, roles were predefined, deviation was discouraged. The goal was not debate, it was continuity. To reinforce this, selected individuals were gradually conditioned. They participated in classified exercises. They were exposed to scenarios involving mass casualties. They were trained to make decisions with incomplete information. Some drills included simulated news reports describing cities destroyed and millions dead. Participants were expected to continue working as if this information were background noise. For some, the experience was deeply disturbing. A few requested removal from the program. Others never spoke about it again. But the system didn't pause. As the Cold War entered its later decades, technology changed, but the philosophy remained. Computers replaced paper files. Satellites replaced landlines. Automation reduced the number of people required. But the core idea stayed the same. A small, controlled group would carry the state forward. Outside the bunkers, Americans lived normal lives. They voted. They protested. They argued about politics on television. Inside classified planning rooms, those debates were considered luxuries. In a post-attack world, planners assumed democracy would be temporarily impractical. Elections require stability. Free speech requires infrastructure. Rights require enforcement. And nuclear war would shatter all three. So continuity plans quietly allowed for governance by decree. Orders would be issued. Compliance would be expected. Restoration of normal law would come later, when conditions allowed. Exactly when that would be was never clearly defined. This ambiguity was intentional. Emergency authority thrives on flexibility, and that flexibility made some officials uneasy. Over time, concerns were raised, mostly behind closed doors. What if the emergency never truly ended? What if the people in charge became comfortable underground? What if temporary stretched into years? These questions were acknowledged, but rarely answered. Because answering them would require confronting an uncomfortable truth. Once activated, the continuity system could reshape the country without public consent. By the late Cold War, a strange paradox had emerged. America was preparing to defend democracy by temporarily suspending it. And the people selected to carry out that task were asked to accept that contradiction as a necessary burden. Many did. Some struggled. A few refused. But the system endured, still classified, still maintained, still ready. In the next part, we'll examine how often these plans were rehearsed, how close they came to full activation, and the moments when America quietly stood on the edge of disappearing, while most of its citizens never realized how close it was. For most Americans, the Cold War was something felt in the background, a headline in the newspaper, a speech on television, a passing fear that slowly faded back into daily life. But for those inside the continuity system, the threat was never abstract. It was rehearsed, again and again. Throughout the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, the United States conducted regular continuity exercises. Some announced, others deliberately ambiguous. They carried code names. They were scheduled at odd hours, and they were designed to feel real. Participants were often told very little in advance. They would receive a call, sometimes late at night, sometimes early in the morning. They were instructed to report immediately to a specific location. No explanations, no reassurances, just urgency. Transportation was arranged quietly. Unmarked planes, military convoys, helicopters landing in remote areas. To the outside world, nothing appeared unusual. But beneath the surface, the machinery of emergency government was being tested. One of the most sobering aspects of these drills was how closely they mirrored reality. Simulated reports described nuclear detonations over major cities. Communication blackouts were enforced. Normal chains of command were deliberately broken. Participants were told to assume that large portions of the population, including their own families, were gone. They were expected to continue working anyway. Some exercises lasted hours, others stretched into days. Inside sealed facilities, officials lived under artificial light, cut off from the outside world, unsure whether the crisis was real or simulated. In some cases, even senior participants were not told the truth until the exercise ended. This uncertainty was intentional. Planners believed that hesitation, confusion, and emotional distress would be inevitable in a real crisis, and drills needed to reflect that. There were moments when the line between exercise and reality became dangerously thin. During the Cuban Missile Crisis, several continuity measures were quietly activated. Emergency command centers were staffed. Backup communication systems were brought online. Key officials were prepared for immediate relocation. At least one underground facility was placed on full operational readiness. For 13 days, the country hovered between peace and annihilation. Publicly, Americans watched speeches and trusted that cooler heads would prevail. Privately, contingency planners prepared for the end. Later, during the height of tensions in the early 1980s, similar alarms were triggered. Military exercises conducted by NATO were misinterpreted by Soviet leadership as possible preparations for a real strike. Intelligence channels lit up with warnings. Once again, continuity systems were reviewed. Once again, lists were checked. Once again, the possibility of sudden activation loomed. In each of these moments, the fate of the continuity plan rested on decisions made in hours or minutes. Had a radar signal been misread? Had a message arrived late? Had a single assumption gone unchallenged? The buried government might have become the only government left. What made these near misses especially unsettling was how invisible they were to the public. There were no sirens, no announcements, no clear signs that the country had come close to an irreversible transition. Life went on. People went to work. Children went to school. Television shows aired as scheduled. Meanwhile, beneath layers of concrete and secrecy, officials rehearsed governing a shattered nation. Some participants later described a strange emotional effect. Each drill made the unthinkable feel more normal. The idea of millions dead became a scenario, not a shock. The absence of the public became an assumption, not a tragedy. This normalization worried a small number of insiders. They questioned whether constant rehearsal dulled moral awareness, whether practicing the end of democracy made it easier to accept. But those concerns rarely altered the system, because the logic of continuity planning was relentless. If the plans were not rehearsed, they would fail. If they failed, chaos would follow. And chaos, planners believed, would be worse than authoritarian control. So, the drills continued, year after year. As the Cold War dragged on, something subtle changed. The fear of nuclear war slowly receded from public consciousness, but the infrastructure built to survive it did not disappear. Instead, it became embedded, quietly maintained, quietly modernized. By the late 1980s, the continuity system had reached a paradoxical state. It had never been fully activated, yet it was more elaborate than ever, waiting for a moment that everyone hoped would never come. In the next part, we'll explore what happened to these plans after the Cold War officially ended, and why, despite the collapse of the Soviet Union, the underground government never truly went away. When the Cold War ended, many Americans believed an era of fear had finally closed. The Berlin Wall fell. The Soviet Union collapsed. Nuclear confrontation seemed to belong to the past. There were celebrations, there was relief, and there was a widespread assumption that the machinery built for doomsday would be dismantled. But inside the continuity system, that assumption was quietly rejected. From the perspective of national security planners, the Cold War had not proven that nuclear war would never happen. It had proven something else. That catastrophe could be avoided, sometimes, but never ruled out. So instead of shutting down the underground government, officials reframed it. The enemy was no longer singular. The threat was no longer ideological. It became abstract, unpredictable. The language changed. Instead of nuclear war, planners spoke of national emergencies, catastrophic events, continuity disruptions. The bunkers remained. The lists were updated. The drills continued, though under new names. What changed was visibility. During the Cold War, secrecy was justified by the existence of a clear adversary. Afterward, secrecy became normalized. Continuity planning was now considered a permanent feature of governance, not a temporary response to a specific threat. By the 1990s, responsibility for these plans had shifted. Agencies were reorganized, budgets were redistributed, new technologies were integrated. Satellite communications replaced older systems. Digital databases replaced paper lists. Automation reduced the number of people required to run emergency operations. But the core philosophy remained untouched. In any sufficiently severe crisis, normal democratic processes could be delayed. Authority could be centralized, and decisions could be made without public consent, until stability returned. Exactly when that return would occur remained undefined. This ambiguity was no longer debated. It was accepted. Then came September 11th, 2001. For the first time, the continuity system was activated, not for a hypothetical nuclear exchange, but for a real attack on American soil. As planes struck New York and Washington, emergency protocols moved from theory to action. Government officials were evacuated, secure locations were activated, emergency command centers were staffed. For days afterward, parts of the federal government operated under continuity conditions. Many details remain classified, but what is known confirms a sobering reality. The underground government was not a Cold War relic. It was functional, and it was used. In the years that followed, continuity planning expanded again. This time, the threats were broader. Terrorism, cyber attacks, pandemics, infrastructure collapse. The logic was the same. If systems fail, governance must continue. If society fractures, authority must hold. And if the public cannot participate, decisions must still be made. Quietly, the scope of emergency authority widened. New legal frameworks were introduced. Some powers once reserved for wartime were extended into peacetime, on the condition that they would only be exercised if necessary. Oversight became more complex, accountability more diffuse, and public awareness remained limited. Most Americans assumed that emergency powers were temporary and tightly constrained. Few realized how much of the continuity system now existed in a gray zone, neither fully active nor fully dormant. It was no longer waiting for the end of the world. It was waiting for disruption. By the early 21st century, the underground government had become something paradoxical. It was invisible, yet institutionalized, secret, yet normalized, exceptional, yet permanent. Some former officials expressed concern. They warned that systems built for rare catastrophes were becoming default solutions, that repeated activation, even in limited form, risked lowering the threshold for extraordinary authority. But such warnings rarely gained traction, because continuity planning had become self-justifying. If you questioned it, you were told it existed to protect you. If you asked how long emergency powers might last, you were told the answer depended on conditions. And if you asked who decides when normal governance returns, the answer was rarely clear. By then, the Cold War was long over, but the architecture built to survive it had quietly adapted, still underground, still classified, still operational, and still based on a fundamental assumption that there may come a moment when the country must be governed without its people. In the final part, we'll examine what this means today, what remains active, what has changed, and what it says about the relationship between security, democracy, and the fear that first gave birth to America's hidden government. Today, much of America's Cold War emergency system remains hidden from view, not because it no longer exists, but because it has been absorbed into the background of modern governance. The bunkers are quieter now. Some have been decommissioned, others repurposed. A few remain classified. What matters most is not the concrete or steel. It's the mindset that built them, the belief that there are moments when democracy must pause so that the state can survive. That belief never disappeared. It simply became less visible. In the decades since the Cold War, continuity planning has shifted away from nuclear exchange and toward something broader and more ambiguous. Not a single enemy, not a single event, but instability itself. Modern emergency plans speak in general terms: catastrophic disruption, systemic failure, loss of public order. The language is deliberately vague, because modern crises rarely arrive with warning sirens or declarations of war. They unfold slowly, unevenly, across systems rather than borders. And that makes the question of emergency authority harder to define. When does a crisis truly begin? When does it end? And who gets to decide? The continuity system was originally built for an unmistakable moment, the flash of nuclear light, the silence afterward. Today's emergencies are quieter. A network goes down. Supply chains break. Trust erodes. In those conditions, extraordinary powers can be justified incrementally. One decision at a time. What was once unthinkable becomes procedural. This is not an accusation. It is an observation. Every government prepares for survival. The United States simply prepared more thoroughly and earlier than most. But preparation carries consequences. Systems designed for rare use tend to change behavior when they exist long enough. Officials become accustomed to them. Institutions adapt around them. Emergency logic seeps into normal planning. Over time, the distinction between temporary and permanent blurs. This is where the Cold War emergency plans leave their deepest legacy, not in bunkers or directives, but in precedent. The precedent that, under certain conditions, governance can move out of public view, that decisions can be centralized, that transparency can be delayed, that consent can be postponed, all in the name of protection. For many Americans who lived through the Cold War, this realization is unsettling. They were taught to believe that democracy was strongest in moments of crisis, that openness was a virtue, that power answered to the people. And for the most part, that belief held. But beneath that surface ran a quieter current, one shaped by fear, uncertainty, and the limits of idealism in the face of extinction. The men and women who built the continuity system were not villains. Most believed sincerely that they were safeguarding the nation. They were planners, engineers, civil servants. They worked with the information they had, and the threat they faced was real. Yet their work forces us to confront an uncomfortable question. Can a democracy plan for its own suspension without changing what it is? There is no easy answer. Perhaps the system exists because the alternative, total collapse, was too terrible to accept. Perhaps it remains because dismantling it would require faith in a future no planner can guarantee. Or perhaps it persists simply because systems once built are difficult to undo. What is clear is this: the Cold War never truly ended underground. Its fears were archived, not erased. Its structures adapted, not abandoned. And its assumptions, that survival may require secrecy, hierarchy, and control, remain quietly embedded in modern governance. Most Americans will never see these plans. They may never need to. And if the continuity system does its job perfectly, the public might not even realize it was used. That was always the intention. But understanding that it exists, and why it exists, matters. Because the strength of a society is not only measured by how it survives catastrophe, but by how it returns to itself afterward. Whether emergency becomes exception or habit. Whether fear becomes memory or foundation. The Cold War emergency plans were built to answer one question. How does a nation survive the end of the world? What remains unanswered is a quieter one. How does it survive the measures it took to prepare for it? And that question, left unresolved, may be the true legacy of America's hidden government.